Welcome to another episode of the GisD podcast. Welcome to 2021. It's our first episode of the year. We've kind of revamped things, and we're going to try things a little differently this year. And we hope that you're going to enjoy it and that it will be a real blessing. On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the state of free speech in Canada, the lockdowns in Ontario and the fallout from that. And just generally the state of civil rights in Ontario since the announcement by Doug Ford of the stay-at-home order. As always, I'm joined by my lovely co-host and wife, Elle. Hi,
guys.
Yeah, so hopefully you guys will enjoy today's podcast. Let's get to it.
Prepare yourself, you're about to listen to another episode of the GisD podcast. The sworn enemy of Good's dumbness, and the podcast for all us dummies who fear God more than they fear man. Now here are your hosts, L and CB.
Okay, so we're going to start with talking a little bit about freedom of speech in Canada. Ever since January 6th with the Capitol Hill riots, that seems to be all everyone is talking about, mostly in an American context. But I think that it's important in our own context as Canadians to talk about freedom of speech and the state of freedom of speech in Canada, because there's a lot going on there. And while it's fun to be distracted by the Americans because they like to make things really intense and really like to debate things and make things a little more interesting than they otherwise should be. There's actually a lot going on in Canada, as I mentioned, and so I think we're going to start there. So one of the articles that I came across in the last little while, again, this is our first podcast of the new year, so we're going to kind of cover everything up till today's date, the 23rd of January, everything that's been happening in the new year. So there's an article here from the Post-Millennial, and it's about a Canada Post employee from Regina, whose name is Ramiro Sepulveda, who refused to deliver the anti-Chinese Communist Party newspaper, the Epoch Times. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Epoch Times, they are a anti-Chinese Communist Party newspaper that is based in Canada. It's headed by Chinese Canadians. And they're very concerned with the growing authoritarianism and totalitarianism of the Communist Party in China, and how it is starting to make inroads into Canadian politics and into Canadian news, and how they're perceived in Canadian news. So this Canada Post courier decided that he wasn't going to deliver their newspaper to Canadians, stating that it was due to the paper's anti-Chinese stance, which can rub people the wrong way, with the postal worker asserting that people that don't know how to filter information would be especially prone to the lies that the newspaper spits out. And he based this not on actual lies from the newspaper itself, but rather he referred to a number of allegations that the paper spreads information. So again, it had nothing to do with what the paper actually published. That wasn't why he was demanding that he be allowed to refuse to deliver the mail, or be allowed to, or demanding that Canada Post no longer deliver that paper. No, it was based on allegations.
That's how misinformation starts.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, is that Canada Post responded to this, and Canada Post stated, Canada Post is obligated to deliver any mail that is properly prepared and paid for, unless it is considered non-mailable matter. The courts, which is the Supreme Courts of Canada, have told Canada Post that its role is not to act as a censor of mail or to determine the extent of freedom of expression in Canada. Which seems perfectly reasonable to me. I don't really understand why this gentleman wasn't terminated for not doing his job. But that's neither here nor there. And it's hilarious that he states that the reason he can't deliver the paper is because people don't know how to filter information.
So is he their parent?
Yeah,
That's what I think is interesting about this. Like, he's projecting his views and his thoughts on other people.
Yeah, and I think that this is very dangerous in terms of if what should happen in a free society is if he felt like the Epoch Times was spitting lies and was a racist newspaper against Chinese people, then he should start his own newspaper that actually covers the facts and demonstrates how the Epoch Times is actually spreading misinformation and lies. But it gets even more hilarious because the real people who don't know how to filter information are people like him, the left, because the article goes on to point out that the CBC, the wonderful CBC, the government propaganda arm, was previously forced to issue a correction after referring to the paper as racist and inflammatory and falsely stating that the paper concluded that coronavirus was created in a Wuhan lab. So in other words, this gentleman, Ramiro Sepulveda, who's showing leftist totalitarian tendencies that state that you can only receive information that's approved so that you can be safe. The very agency in Canada that does that the best, the CBC, can't filter out the information and know that this paper isn't racist to the point where they had to be forced to issue a correction.
I'm at a loss for words with it.
Yet the Canada Post Courier doesn't just say, I personally won't deliver the mail. No, he goes on to state, he hopes that Canada Post can create a board which would decide what content should be considered inappropriate for delivery. So not only do we have the government propaganda arm, the CBC, slandering this newspaper, trying to silence their speech, gag their speech, we now have employees at the Canada Post demanding that the Canada Post create a board that will filter out everyone's mail and only allow Canada Post approved mail to be delivered.
Don't you want people going through your mail? I do.
Yeah, so the thing is that what's dangerous about this is not only does this gentleman not want to deliver the Epoch Times and wants to personally stifle their freedom of speech, he wants the Canada Post to stifle everyone's freedom of speech, because he may disagree with them.
Yep.
And this is the reason that on this podcast we are not leftists. Leftists are as we understand them, are people who not just have a socialist or communist framework from which they want society to work off of, but they demand that you must bow down to and cater to and be subservient to that socialist communist framework. And if you disagree, then they have the right to deny your rights enshrined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that's what's so dangerous about progressivism, about leftism, whatever you want to call it, That's really the problem with it.
It's not very progressive.
Right.
It's not very loving, even though that's how they love to frame it.
Yeah, exactly. They always love to frame it as, well, aren't you so much safer now that we've gagged and bound you and prevented you from having your freedom of speech? You're so much safer now.
Mm-hmm.
Because now we can control your speech and we can make sure that you're safe. If you don't like the freedom of speech that we've given you, well, then we just need to make sure that you get a little more education, a little more, as they're saying in the States, a little more deprogramming, so that we can make sure that you're safe and you're docile and the government can rule over you. To prove that this isn't just an isolated incident, and to fully grasp the state of freedom of speech here in Canada at this moment in time, we need to understand that this leftist progressive idea is not just held by a few isolated wackos out there, but as we learned recently, the Trudeau Liberals are moving forward with a plan to, quote unquote, weed out hate speech and harassment from the internet. And in fact, they will be presenting their plan to Cabinet next week, and if approved, the legislation would allow the government to give big tech giants such as Google, Facebook, and Twitter fines for not removing content deemed illegal. So here we have this gentleman over in Regina demanding Canada Post sort through everyone's mail and only allow approved mail containing approved speech to be delivered to Canadians, amongst Canadians. But we now have the federal government coming in and saying that we are going to fine these big companies for if they do not remove content that the government deems illegal from their servers, from their platforms. And if I'm a company and I'm a big tech company and I'm looking at this, I'm going, I need to stifle any speech that the government may deem illegal, as opposed to only speech that is illegal, because I don't want to be fined. Mm-hmm. I don't want to have to deal with that hassle.
Yeah.
And in fact, this operation by the federal government is going to be so big that, quote, it would likely involve the creation of a new government regulator. Twitter, Facebook, and Google and other tech juggernauts acted swiftly. So we're going to have a new bureaucracy that's going to handle this. That's how intensive and how all-encompassing the federal government intends this to be. So, excuse me. This move to censor or regulate Canada's internet has been vocally supported by Trudeau and by, in particular, the Heritage Minister, Stephen Guilbeault, who actually proposed similar regulations back in February of 2020. So this has been in the works for a long time. It's just that the federal government is trying to take advantage of the situation now, while everyone is distracted by free speech in the United States, that debate that's happening south of our border. And they're trying to take advantage of that and saying, we're going to do something good for Canadians so that what's happening in the States, which is the silencing and gagging of free speech that's not approved by the establishment, the government establishment, we're going to prevent that from happening in Canada. Not by doing the opposite and allowing more freedom of speech. No, by building a bureaucracy that will also gag freedom of speech for those that are promoting speech that's not approved by the government. These new regulations to ban social media posts will be done on posts that are deemed hurtful or offensive. We want to protect Canadians online, the minister said. So again, it's not just going to be posts that are deemed illegal. So slander is the biggest one. Posts inciting violence, that I can kind of understand because we have laws on the books already that that punish people for that kind of speech, and that those actions such as slander and inciting violence are already illegal. So that I kind of understand. What I don't understand is how are they ever going to deem a post based on a objective set of criteria that everyone can adhere to in society. How are they going to deem a post hurtful or offensive based on an objective set of facts? The truth is they can't.
Mm-mm. It's all about feelings and whoever's, I guess, deemed the most, the vulnerable group or the minority group or whatever.
Right. So the government's coming and saying, we're going to prevent what happened on the Capitol Hill. We're going to prevent the Capitol Hill riots by removing speech on these platforms that incites violence. Okay, that's a debate that we can have. But they want to open this up to, we can control everyone's posts, because as long as we can deem that someone was offended by your post, we can stifle your freedom of speech and control you. So our situation in Canada is just as bad when it comes to freedom of speech, or equally bad when it comes to freedom of speech, as the United States. Yet what's happening is everyone is being distracted by what's going on in the States right now, and the government is using that distraction to try and push this bill through that will actually allow them, whoever's in power in the government, to control the narrative, to control what is said in the public square to such a degree that anyone who dissents and therefore offends the government
that's what
will
really
be
matters,
silenced.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's whatever they deem.
And all of this comes, unbelievably, all of this comes at a time when the Montreal Economic Institute, which looked at different countries around the world, suggested that there is a direct correlation between high levels of GDP and broad allowance for freedom of speech in a society. And the Montreal Economic Institute report goes into depth about this and shows directly that there's a clear correlation between the two. And so they're arguing that if Canadians actually want to be wealthy, then embracing a broadening of free speech in Canada, as opposed to this new bureaucracy that Trudeau wants to pass to silence everyone, that by embracing broader freedom of speech, Canadians will actually be better off and more better off, not just because they have more rights, but better off and freedom, but better off economically because of that. Which, as conservatives, as libertarians, isn't surprising that when you allow people to do what the heck they want, they're going to look out for themselves and they're going to better their own situation. So we have all this going on in Canada, remarkably at a time when people around the world, including the president of Germany, including the leader of Mexico, are coming out and saying that what these platforms are doing and what the Biden and the Trudeau administration are doing in silencing people is going to create such chaos and create such such a dark winter, as Biden put it, that they themselves and their countries would never allow this to happen. I mean, it really is a dark day when North America is deemed by Europe and by Latin America to be less free and less well off because of our governments. which don't have the corruption like they do in Latin America, don't have the socialism and the communism and the fascism like they do in Europe to such an extent. So we really are entering what Biden called the dark winter. So part of this new dark winter, which by the way, can I just say, anyone who thought that 2021 was going to be better than 2020, I hate to say I told you so, but unfortunately we can't get refunds for 2021. So here we are. As much as I would love to get my money back on my free 30-day trial so far of 2021, unfortunately I can't get it back. I would do anything to get no money, to end 2021, but that's not going to happen. So part of the lovely 2021 calendar was Doug Ford announcing on the 12th or the 13th. I believe it was the 12th. On the 14th, that Ontario was entering a stay-at-home order emergency situation. So we were going to have a second state of emergency declared, and we are now under a stay-at-home order. And that prompted, on June 15th, Roman Baber, who is the MPP for York, for the York riding, to write a letter to the Premier Doug Ford, asking him to end the lockdown. And I don't know, for those of you who watched the press conference, which everyone rightfully so is saying was super confusing, the press conference at which Doug Ford announced the stay-at-home order. But Doug Ford didn't talk about any of the medical data to justify the stay-at-home order. He didn't talk about any of the specific recommendations made by the health experts. He just said, we must do this. And so Roman Baber wrote a very thorough letter to Premier Doug Ford, asking him to not only renounce the stay-at-home order, but end the lockdown based on the medical data. So I'm going to go through Roman Baber's letter because everyone's kind of been talking about it the past couple weeks. It's a really fascinating letter. I highly recommend that you go on Twitter and you go to Roman Baber's page and you get a hold of this letter and you read it yourself. Because I've always held that the vaccine is not what's going to get us out of this mess that we've created, in which the virus continues to kill people, dozens and dozens of people each day, and yet, while at the same time our government keeps getting more and more totalitarian and more oppressive, vaccines are not going to be what saves us from this. Vaccines may work. I'm highly skeptical myself, but we've yet to see the full extent of the medical data about that, so I'm reserving judgment. But vaccines are not going to be what's going to save us from this mess. Because even if we end the crisis of the virus, people are still going to be manipulated by the media and by the government to allow the government to continue its totalitarian ways because by threat of the virus. They're going to continue to use the threat of the virus to keep people at home, even when the vaccines are here. That's why they're already talking about, like, oh, we have this mutant strain from Britain. Oh, that wasn't doing anything. We only had like a dozen people get it. Oh, okay. Well, we now have this mutant strain from Brazil. And these mutant strains may render the vaccine effective. So again, I don't think the vaccine is going to get us out of this mess we've created for ourselves. I think information about the virus itself, the actual medical data, and disseminating that amongst the citizenry here in Canada is what is going to save us from this mess we've created.
just going on a side point here, I just think it's really sad that, I don't know, just the state here is kind of starting to remind me of Germany, with neighbors snitching on each other and just like, oh, and then just blaming it on COVID or whatever it is. It's really sad to just see the fact that we can't spend time with our families. We can't, trust our neighbors. It's just like we're living in like Germany 1930s, 1940s. It's just like soon they're going to have our own children snitch on us. Like, it's just this. And people are believing it. And it's like, have we not learned from history? Have we not seen this happen already before? But because it's a virus, it's okay. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me.
It's like that lady who got fined $880 because she needed to go grocery shopping, and she was being a responsible guardian by leaving her parents in the care of their grandparents.
Her children.
Yeah. So leaving her children in the care of her grandparents. So she was making sure that her children had the proper care that they needed, so that she could go grocery shopping and provide for them. And she was fined $880 by the police because a neighbor snitched on her and said she was violating the lockdown orders. And even when the police, if you read the details of that incident, even when the police pulled her over, they did not specify how she had broken the law. They did not say it was because she left her children with her grandparents. They did not say it was because she visited her grandparents. They did not specify it at all. They simply kept saying over and over, generically, that she had broken the Ontario Reopening Act. So, in other words, she hasn't broken any part of the act, at least according to the police officers who are fining her. But she's still going to get fined under the act. And that's not to mention your point of like, why would a neighbor do that to another neighbor?
Yeah.
Right? It's not like they were having a party and they were doing something that was frivolous. She was trying to provide for her children, and you do that to somebody. And the other thing too that people have been pointing out is like, since when does somebody complaining about somebody result in the police finding you? Like, that's really terrible, because the police didn't even witness her with the being in the house. They pulled her over on the side of the road after she left with her children in the backseat. So it's like you weren't even there necessarily to see her children there with her, but then you pulled her over because somebody complained about her, and you found the vehicle that they were complaining about. Like, I don't know, that's just really terrifying to me. We hold on this show that the dissemination of the medical data about the virus is what's going to relieve the fear that people are being fed by the media and by the government about this virus, and that is what is going to enable us as a citizenry to kind of become sane again and start to actually deal with this virus in an effective way, while also not throwing the baby, which is our liberty, out with the bathwater over a virus. Mm-hmm. So Roman Baber does a really good job in this letter to Doug Ford in pointing out the medical data that Ontarians need to know to start pushing back against these totalitarian lockdowns. So he in his letter he lists he goes through a list of 6 different things that compare the negative impact of the lockdowns versus COVID. So the negative impacts of the lockdowns, he goes through 6 things, and I'll just read them here quickly. So he writes, hot zones like Toronto and Peel have been in lockdown since Thanksgiving without success, but the lockdowns are objectively deadlier than COVID. For example, Cancer screenings at Princess Margaret are back to 60%, with oncologists fearing a tsunami of cancer. Ontario's overdose rate is trending 50% above normal. The growth in the number of Ontarians who died of overdose in 2020 may be higher than the number of people who died from COVID outside of long-term care centers. C. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, in September 2020, 1 in 10 adults reported recently having thoughts or feelings of suicide. And amongst Canadians aged 19 to 35, so that's our young people, that rate is 2 out of 10 people. 2 out of 10 people have had feelings or thoughts about suicide. D. Sick kids are calling the increase of eating disorders in young people an unprecedented crisis. E. Tens of thousands of businesses have been shut down, and in Ontario alone, it's 25,000. So think about how many across Canada, but in Ontario alone, it's just been 25,000 businesses that have shuttered permanently. And the unemployment rate is nearly double, with 320,000 people not being able to regain work. And we are faced with a catastrophic wave of bankruptcies and foreclosures, which again, a lot of economists are predicting are going to happen this year. So if you think January is bad, just wait till the rest of 2021. And lastly, he points out the government is criminalizing normal human behavior, such as that lady that dropped off her kids, and putting law-abiding Ontarians in legal jeopardy. Public health can't change human behavior. And I agree with this. You don't ask, for example, you don't ask a tiger not to eat a baby lamb. The tiger is going to do what the tiger does. Just like us, we're social creatures. We have known this forever. And we need human contact and human interaction. And staring at a screen is not human contact or human interaction. Human contact and human interaction is human contact and human interaction. So we've known this for a long time that we need to figure out a way to foster the best in humankind and allow humankind to flourish and live victoriously in the presence of this virus. But that's not what the government cares about. The government doesn't care about our livelihoods. The government doesn't care about our family. The government doesn't care about our health, other than if you die from this virus, supposedly.
Yeah, supposedly, because they don't care about if you die any other way.
Yeah, exactly. So he points out that those are the six major impacts, and there are more, but those are the 6 major impacts on society that the lockdowns themselves have caused. And can I just say something? I'm tired of these people on social media who keep blaming other people for the fact that the lockdowns aren't working. Lockdowns, wherever they have been tried, whether it's Italy, whether it's New York, they don't work. They've never worked. The WHO, the CDC have come out and said they don't work, but we continue to do them. Which, again, begs the question, if they don't work to prevent the virus, then why are we doing them if we're trying to prevent the virus by doing them? In other words, maybe these lockdowns aren't about a virus. Maybe these lockdowns are about government control over people's lives, and they want to see how much control they can get over our lives before we actually push back. And so far, especially in Canada, we have not done a good job pushing back because we have not equipped ourselves with the medical data that Roman Baber is pointing out in this letter. So he goes on, he says, okay, so those are the 6 impacts of the lockdown. So what's the impact of COVID? So he writes, COVID is real, but the fear of COVID is exaggerated. Why? Why is it exaggerated? While every death is tragic, he writes, after 10 months, we learned that COVID is not nearly as deadly as first thought. It has a 99.98% infection survival rate. This is according to the CDC. So the survival rate for COVID is 99.98%. And it's even higher in people 64 and younger. And in fact, not only is the survival rate 99.98%, but the infection mortality rate. So this is talking about people who actually die from it, not just people who get the virus and then they have prolonged symptoms from the virus, which does happen. But these are people who actually die from it. Is half that of the common flu amongst people 64 and younger, and is equal to that of the common flu for those 65 and older. This is why we've seen in 2020 we had an equal number of deaths compared to the previous 5 years pre-pandemic. So from 2014 to 2019, we had roughly the same total number of deaths each year as we did in 2020, because this virus is not as deadly as the media and the government keeps pushing. Again, how do we know this? Because of the medical data. Another thing that Doug Ford kept pushing when he kept saying we need the stay-at-home order, because of the modeling, because of this, because that, was we need the stay-at-home order in order to save our medical system, because our ICU capacity and our medical system is overwhelmed. So Roman Baber directly addresses this, and he points out that in December 2019, pre-pandemic, our ICU capacity was at 95%. What was it as of January? So as of this month, it's lower, and it's at 87.6%. So the amount of ICU capacity we have available is higher now than it was in December. And yet Doug Ford is out there peddling that we need to save the healthcare system by locking down. And as Roman Baber continues in his letter, he points out there are currently 385 COVID ICU patients. That's less than one patient per Ontario's 492 hospitals. So again, we have less than one patient for every hospital in Ontario that is in the ICU being treated for COVID. And our system is about to break. If that is true, then as I've been saying for a long time, maybe the government-run socialist, communist healthcare system that we have in Canada sucks. And maybe the system isn't worth saving because it sucks. So he goes on because another thing that Doug Ford pointed out was we need the stay-at-home order and we need to close schools because we can't take a risk due to the deadly nature of COVID-19 with our children. So Roman Babar goes on to talk about that. So he says the lockdown, quote, I'm quoting from the letter now, the lockdown is having catastrophic effects on Ontario's children. Constituents tell me that their children have developed anxiety, and we are scaring our children even though they are 100% safe. The government should also follow sick kids' advice against masking kids at school. The crisis in LTC homes is in long-term care homes, so LTC homes are long-term care homes. The crisis is in long-term care homes, again, because people over the age of 65 are the primary people that are vulnerable to this virus. And so the crisis is in long-term care homes, not in schools. Excuse me. And so he goes on, and I want to stop here and talk about the sick kids' advice against masking at school. So way back when, a long time ago, in March, one of the first things Ontario did when we entered the lockdowns was shut down all the schools. Okay, all we had back then was the medical data coming out of China, which were anecdotes of journalism pointing out the bodies that were being pulled out of these hospitals and being buried in Iranian graves in Iran and being taken out of the hospitals in Italy, these dead bodies. Okay, so we need to pause, and we need to have a 2-week lockdown in order to prepare for the impact of the virus and in order to prevent the spread of the virus because it was now in our communities. Okay, so fine. Because again, all we had back then, we didn't have the medical data that we do now. I was on board with that because again, we didn't have the medical data that we have now. So fast forward a little bit to June. We now have medical data. We have 3 months of medical data, and Sick Kids releases a report on June 17th titled Recommendations for Reopening Schools. In that report, they recommend that when everything is taken into consideration, so that the psychological impact on children, the educational impact on children, the socioeconomic status of different children, the threat of the virus amongst children and in schools, when everything is taken into consideration, they recommended that schools reopen fully in person and that social distancing should not be promoted amongst children because of the psychological harm it does to them. And that there is no reason for them to wear a mask. Why? Because we know that masks don't work. This is in the report. We know that masks don't work. We know that improper use of masks spreads the virus. And we know that masking children makes it difficult for them to breathe and has a psychological impact on them that is catastrophic for them. So in other words, Sick Kids recommended in this report, and again, Sick Kids in Toronto is one of the prominent hospitals in the entire world when it comes to the health of children. And they're recommending reopen schools fully, go back to normal, do not require kids to wear a mask, and do not enforce social distancing based on the medical data. So what did Doug Ford do? Online learning, which has been catastrophic and awful. The quality has been awful and it's just been catastrophic on children, which is why we're seeing extremely high rates of suicide amongst young people. What else did Doug Ford do? Close the schools. Why? Because the unions in our schools demanded that they close. And Doug Ford, instead of standing up for people's civil liberties in Ontario, instead of standing up for our children, instead of educating the populace with the medical data, and following the recommendations of the health experts, said he was doing that, but actually cowed to the unions. The teachers' unions that didn't want to work. So again, if you have the medical data, that is the way out, because the medical data strips you of the fear that the media and the government is pushing on you in order to allow them to strip you of your civil rights. So all this information in this letter by Roman Baber is well documented. Is referenced. He has the references at the bottom of the letter. A lot of this information is actually found on government-based websites, government institutions, healthcare institutions, and so all this information being presented by Roman Baber was received by Doug Ford, and this was Mr. Ford's response. Effective immediately, Mr. Baber will no longer be sitting as a member of the PC caucus and will not be permitted to seek re-election as a PC member. So not only will Mr. Baber not be part of the caucus, which, fine, if you want to have a unified caucus, you want to have a unified front at this time, I understand. But to kick him out of the Progressive Conservative Party, that's ridiculous. Mr. Ford went on to say in his statement, his official statement about removing Mr. Baber from the PC caucus, Mr. Baber's comments are irresponsible. By spreading misinformation, he is undermining the tireless efforts of our frontline healthcare workers at this critical time and is putting people at risk. I will not jeopardize a single Ontarian's life by ignoring public health advice.
That's just laughable.
Mr. Ford, the public health advice was that we should reopen the schools and go back to life. So if you're not, so you're putting every single Ontarian's life in jeopardy because you are ignoring the public health advice, which is what Mr. Baber pointed out in this letter. And then even better, as my father always taught me, if you didn't laugh, you would just cry. So even better, he goes on to say, there is no room for political ideology in our fight against COVID-19. Rather, our response has been and always will be driven by evidence and data. Your
That's
response,
laughable.
Mr. Ford, included no evidence and data, but this letter did. And on top of that, you're stating that political ideology doesn't matter, but then this MPP who dared to disagree with the government narrative and talk about the medical data can no longer be part of your PC party because he doesn't share the same political ideology as you.
This just shows how they're shutting people up. Anyone who goes against them, even in politics. It doesn't matter who you are. They're going to shut you up.
Yeah, exactly. Even people who represent the people of their riding, they don't care about that. Again, so this is something that is a big, long discussion, but I'll just point out here. Mm-hmm. We need to understand that when the government, which is predominantly dominated by the left, talks about democracy, they mention that what they're talking about is everyone's shared understanding of a representative form of government in which the majority has more power than the others in society to make the decisions for society. But that is not actually what they mean. What they mean by democracy is the correct outcomes, according to the left, coming to pass in society. Mm-hmm. So again, this is about the correct outcomes, which is a totalitarian communist state coming in, over the medical data.
Yeah, because
that's what they mean
aren't
about
looking
democracy.
at the actual medical data.
Right. So they don't. The government doesn't care if this guy was democratically elected and is speaking on behalf of his constituents. They don't care because what he is saying is not the correct outcome for society.
Yeah.
Another gentleman who is now an independent, the MPP Randy Hillier from the Kingston riding, who has also been a staunch opponent of COVID-19 lockdowns, commented on this situation. I found his comments fascinating. So he commented and he said, Randy Hillier said, "It is so self-evident. It is as clear as an uncloudy day. Our response to COVID is far more enduring and far more harmful than the virus itself. Mm-hmm. And all the evidence and the facts are there. The people are not wanting to see the facts." And I would add to that, and the media and the government are deliberately hiding them and not talking about them, but simply claiming to talk about them when they're not.
Because if you look at the news, you turn on the TV anytime and you listen to them talking about COVID, it's such fear-mongering that they just push down your throat. And they just... If I were to just go by the news, I'd be afraid myself. So we as Ontarians, as Canadians, we need to wake up and do our own research. Don't just believe what other people tell you. Do your own research. Look it up for yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and that's why I encourage everyone listening to this.
Don't just believe what we say.
Yeah, go on Twitter and get the actual medical data. Get the actual letter from Roman Baber and read it yourself.
Before they deem it illegal.
Yeah, before they remove it from the platform because it's offensive to the government because it's not towing their narrative.
Yeah.
Like, this is the dangerous spot we're in, is that instead of talking about any of the medical data that is referenced and established and actually put out by prominent institutions about COVID-19. So instead of talking about what was actually in that letter, the media simply talked about the growing divide between Roman Baber and Doug Ford, which is not the story. Oh. If the media actually cared about us, actually cared about getting to the truth for Canadians, the actual story would be the medical data in this letter.
Yep. But media doesn't do its job anymore. They don't. It's not real. They don't do real reporting. They don't do real research. They just, whatever the government decides it is, they just throw out that narrative to us, right? And then those of us, and then especially if you think about people who are older generations, I would say older generations than me, I know that, they've been able to maybe trust the media in the past and believe it. So, they have no reason to question it. But no, you have to, because things have changed. Things are not like they used to be. We are entering a new era. And we definitely need to back up this information and look it up ourselves. The internet is, right now, it's free, and it's you can do research on for yourself, but who knows how long that's going to last, right?
Especially when they start scrubbing things, and when big tech and government keep getting cozier and cozier, and they start burying things on the Google search, or eliminating things temporarily as an experiment, like they did in Australia, Google did, from the Google search. Well, then all you're going to be left with is the government narrative when you search on Google. And I think it's just, like you've been saying, like, we as Canadians, and I'm going to use Randy Hillier's quote here, because he says, "I know it's sometimes hard to speak outside of the herd, but that's why we get elected. We're supposed to be leaders, not followers. Leadership sometimes comes with some bruises." And that is what is, and if we as Canadian citizens don't start talking about this information, don't start disseminating it amongst ourselves, don't start demanding that we act as leaders in our own lives, why should we expect our political leaders to?
Yep.
Like, we all know that politicians, for the most part, aren't worth the breath they're using. But if we don't have standards in our own lives, such as the truth matters, and fear will not control me, if we don't have those standards, those limited, minimal standards, how can we expect our politicians, our healthcare system, our media to have those standards as well?
Yeah.
They serve us, not the other way around. And that's what has become increasingly clear to me, is that we as Canadians have forgotten that a legitimate government is not legitimate because it is the government. It is legitimate because it serves and is based on the will of the people. It is based on our voluntary consent to be under their authority. Their authority derives from us. Their authority does not derive from themselves because they are the government.
Yeah. We as Canadians, we need to wake up. We need to look at our own politics, not look at our neighbors' politics, which I think we've been doing way too long. Like, I love the States, God bless America, but we're allowing so many things to happen in our own backyard because we're looking at our neighbors.
Yeah.
Right? We need to stop looking and stop being distracted by what's going on over there, and have our politicians be accountable and not let them do all these sneaky things while we've got our back face towards them. Like, we need to wake up. We need to start demanding things from our politicians as a people.
Yeah, and I think even before we go there, even though that's important, I think we need to start educating ourselves. Too long we've relied on our public education system, which, by the way, is run by the government, and big tech, which, by the way, has shown now, the mask is off, that they care about themselves. They don't care about you. And we need to start educating ourselves. Like, for example, they were talking about this a lot the past week. There's a new poll that came out that was conducted by Ledger and the Association for Canadian Studies, or Leger, as they keep saying. And it asked Canadians if they would support curfews to curb COVID spread if it was recommended by healthcare officials. So in given that question, 65% said they would support a nighttime curfew, 23% were opposed to a nighttime curfew, and I don't know who you are or what rock you've been living under, but 12% didn't know. Like, hello? How can you not know what to do about COVID at this stage in the game, people? And this is what I mean, is there's a whole bunch of uneducated people, usually in the range of 10 to 20%, that don't know, and that's scary. Yeah. And yet, at the same time, while 65% would support a nighttime curfew if imposed on them. So again, we need to understand what a nighttime curfew is. A nighttime curfew means that there's a police state from the time the curfew goes into effect until the next morning when it's no longer in effect. And that keeps happening over and over again. So we want to live in a police state half our day. Congratulations. Mm-hmm. Good luck with that. So while 65% of people want a police state, 41% of people think that implementing a police state, a nighttime curfew, would not even curb COVID-19. So at the same time that we believe that implementing a police state would not do anything, we would welcome a police state. Hello?
Backwards thinking is that.
Hello?
Anyone home?
Yeah. Like, I'm Canadian. I have my views on the states. Go States. But this has been my frustration with Canadians, is unlike in the States, we don't like to think for ourselves. We like the government to take care of all our problems. But the problem with that is the government doesn't care about fixing your problems. The government cares about their power. And so as long as we keep giving the government more and more power to fix our problems, they're just going to continue to take that power while not fixing our problems. Hence why Doug Ford was considering a curfew, even though 41% of us and the medical data and the health experts all know that a curfew won't work. And not only do we know from the medical data it won't work, we know where it's been implemented that it doesn't work. And yet we would all happily go along with it because it looks like the government is fixing our problems, when really the government is just claiming more power. And Canadians need to start waking up and thinking for themselves and educating themselves and really understanding the liberal values that our Western society was founded on. So for those of us who are trying to stand up, who are trying to speak out, who are trying to educate our fellow citizens, who are protesting the government, we're now being silenced. And we're going to be silenced on social media, as we talked about earlier in this podcast. And we're going to be silenced at the government buildings, at town hall, in the streets. We're not going to be allowed to protest. And you know why I know this? Because Doug Ford, for the past going on 12 months now, probably 10 months now, has been saying, come on down. We welcome protests. It's everyone's right to protest. Everyone has a right to be heard because we live in a free society. Until now. And the reason I say until now is because an essential exercise march was held by anti-lockdown protesters. And unlike previous weeks, they were greeted by a heavy police presence at Yonge and Dundas Square. And police can be seen on multiple videos that are now circulating online. So I would highly urge you to go check those out. Placing the protesters under arrest. Protesters stressed their right to protest, but the police responded by arresting one, while other protesters urged everyone to not group together and not engage with the police. So while protesters were protesting and trying to social distance, so trying to follow the government guidelines, and they were outside where social distancing and wearing masks isn't required, the police were arresting people. Because, again, anyone who stands up against this narrative being pushed by the government that we must live in a totalitarian society in order to fix the virus is going to be silenced. And the even when the demonstration was winding down with crowds of protesters singing "O Canada" and then chanting "We are essential," referring to the arbitrary distinction between essential workers who are allowed to work versus non-essential workers who have been barred from working or operating their business during the lockdown, tensions flared back up shortly afterward as more scuffles with police occurred and more arrests of protesters were made in the square. So even as these people were winding down and they were gonna go, no, that wasn't good enough. The police had to get up in everyone's face and start arresting people because they hold a different narrative based on the medical data than the government's narrative based on nothing. And this is really dangerous because it clearly shows that if you agree with the government narrative, you belong to one class of citizen. And if you disagree with the government narrative, you belong to another. And this is highlighted no better than this other story that I came across that talks about inspectors find 1/3 of big box stores violating COVID rules in GTA and Hamilton. So Ontario safety inspectors performed an inspection blitz across the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton on Saturday, finding nearly 1/3 of all stores in violation of pandemic safety rules. Despite these violations, so inspectors visited over 110 stores, finding 31 of them to be in violation of health protocols. But despite these violations, only 11 warnings and 11 tickets were issued over health violations, with 5 locations being fined. The rest of the locations appear to have gotten off scot-free. The government ultimately inspected 240 stores across the province, with 75 found to be in violation of the pandemic rules. So you have these big box stores, this one class of citizen, who has been pushing this narrative, following the narrative, advertising the narrative on television and radio, that we need to social distance, we need to wear masks, we need to have all our civil rights stripped from us in order to fix this virus. Yet, small businesses who complied with the coronavirus rules are being shut down because they're too small. In fact, over 25,000 private businesses in Ontario have permanently closed.
They don't care about Ontarians. They don't care about their livelihood.
Right. And again, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, is this all happened right after that press conference where Doug Ford says, I'm going to be like an angry 800-pound gorilla on the backs of these big box stores if they violate COVID rules. They violate COVID rules, nothing happens. Why? Because they're in bed with the government is getting power from them, and over Ontarians Because again, the government doesn't care about your problems.
Mm-mm.
The government cares about its power.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why it is essential we have limited government.
Mm-hmm. Power, money, greed. That's all they care about. They don't care about the people.
Right. Because
the people of Ontario, they do not care. They could give a rat's ass about us.
Especially when you consider that if you've put 25,000 businesses, small business owners, private citizens, who out of business, your only tax base left is big corporations. Mm-hmm. So of course you're not going to go after them or punish them in any way. Mm-hmm. You need their money because you need your power.
I think that's a lot of people that have lost their job. That's more than 25,000. Just like what?
Yeah, that's not just, let's say they were all sole proprietorships. That's 25,000 business owners alone. But that's not even considering their families, mm-hmm. their employees mm-hmm. that are impacted by this, the employees' families that are impacted by the loss of their job. Like, and again, nobody cares. In fact, you have people on social media. You even have Doug Ford coming out and saying, you who are violating the lockdowns, it's because you don't love your family. It's because you don't love your grandma enough to follow the government narrative and the government lockdowns. And I'm sorry, but every Ontarian should take offense, like real actual offense to that statement.
Yeah. That
I don't love my family because I would rather follow the medical data. And now we're seeing the historical data about lockdowns. And provide for my family and take care of my family and do what's best for my family. Then follow the government narrative and live in a totalitarian state. And it's gotten so bad that as I mentioned, it's not just Doug Ford and politicians and media figures on social media saying this to one another. It is actual citizens saying it to actual citizens.
It's because they believe the lies, though. Like
because they have so much fear.
Yeah.
So I know that this got kind of intense. So we're going to end on a kind of a funny note. One of the things that was debated about this past 10 months or so was whether the government was going to implement vaccine passports. And while we don't know the answer to that in Ontario yet, because they've said yes and they haven't retracted that statement, they've left it alone, but they haven't retracted it yet. But at least for now, it seems that we won't get vaccine passports for Canadians. So Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was saying his government has no plans to implement vaccine passports. Quote, I think it's an interesting idea, but I think it's also fraught with challenges. We are certainly encouraging and motivating people to get vaccinated as quickly as possible, but we also know there are people who won't get vaccinated, and not necessarily through a personal or political choice. So again, the reason he won't implement vaccine passports and officially create a second-class citizenry if you don't get the vaccine is not because that would strip you of your constitutionally guaranteed rights, because you refuse to get it because of a political or personal choice. So again, it's not because you have the right in a free society to dissent from the government narrative. That's not why he's not going to do it. No, he's not going to do it because there are people who might have medical issues that will prevent them from getting the vaccine that will support him. So, again, we're just lucky as Canadians, I guess, that we have a government that's so benevolent to us that while they would like to crush our dissent and our right to dissent, they're so loving that because there are sick people that might not get the vaccines that support them, they're not going to crush us yet. Again, I know this podcast got a little intense. We're going to do a new segment now called Good News, Bad News. So we're going to end off with this. I don't know. It's up to my lovely wife, Elle, here, whether we're going to end with the bad news or end with the good news. But I'm thinking since we're on a roll with bad news right now, maybe we could roll into the bad news and then get to the good news. But yeah, so good news, bad news.
Alrighty. Good news, bad news. So, breaking. Ford announces first new Ontario hospital to be built in over 30 years. $125 million investment for COVID hotspots. So, Premier Doug Ford announced that the provinces will open Ontario's first newly built hospital in over 30 years. Wow. The Courtucelli Vaughan Hospital will open on February 7th to treat COVID-19 patients, opening up an additional 185 care beds, with 35 of them for critical care. Quote, Ford said, with many of our hospitals, ICUs approaching full capacity or beyond, this new hospital is relief. It's added capacity for all those heroes who are stretched to the limit right now. This hospital will take... he also did say, this hospital will take in critical care patients from surrounding hospitals to help ease the capacity pressures around COVID-19. Ford also announced an investment of $125 million for new beds in Toronto, Windsor, Durham, Kingston, and Ottawa, in addition to the 3,100 beds added in the initial COVID-19 response. So, it's good that we're getting another hospital. Hospitals are always good.
Although we should point out that the hospital has been in construction since 2011, which is
a
whole decade before the pandemic got here.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's good news for Canadians, but it's more just good fortune for Doug Ford, not because he actually has anything to do with it.
Yeah, he didn't. So, bad news, I guess.
I mean, just in case you couldn't tell that we're not part of Ford Nation.
Yeah, no, we definitely are not. For those of you who want the vaccines, I suppose this is bad news for you. Pfizer reducing vaccine shipments to Canada amid production issues. The procurement minister, Anita Anand, announced on Friday that Canadian procurement of Pfizer coronavirus vaccine will be reduced as the company faces production issues. This is from CP24. The company is reducing shipments outside of the United States as the European facilities face production problems. Anand said this is unfortunate. However, such delays and issues are to be expected when global supply chains are stretched well beyond their limits. Why don't we produce our own vaccines here? Why do we have to rely on other countries? Sorry, just saying that. And that also said that while
then we would live in a capitalist society that was free and independent.
Right? And that also said that while the delays slow the procurement of the vaccine, it will not grind the process to a complete halt. And Canada will still receive smaller shipments of vaccine dosages. Canada was supposed to have procured 4 million doses of the vaccine by the end of April, according to Anand. Such procurement is still possible, but not guaranteed. So just a little, side note, coronavirus has infected over 700,000 Canadians since the beginning of the pandemic and has taken the lives of more than 17,000 people.
And yet our wonderful, benevolent government is doing nothing about ensuring we have the vaccines.
Yep. Well, our government's slow to act with everything.
Again, if you want to follow us or send us comments or questions that maybe we'll answer on the show, or just get involved and get informed, you can go to Good Is Dumb Podcast. We're on Twitter. We were on Parler. We hope to get back up and running once Parler's back up and running. So Twitter, Facebook. Those are our two main ones right now. Mm-hmm. But again, we hope to be back on Parler soon. And
pass us along. Don't be afraid to share us to other people. I know we're just starting. We've only had 2 shows, but we do plan on doing this more regularly, guys. We're hoping for it to be a bi-weekly thing.
Yeah, we're hoping it'll be a weekly or a bi-weekly thing. Again, keep in mind we do have 2 very young children, so they keep us really busy.
Yeah.
But we do want to make the show a priority, and we do want to make it weekly or bi-weekly, and bring that unique Canadian perspective to Canadian politics that is too often lacking, because conservatives are either too enamored with the States to talk about Canada, even though they are Canadian, or
there's just not a voice on our side.
Yeah,
on this side of politics.
Yeah, or there's just no conservative people in Canada.
No, there are people. Yeah, I know you're out there. You will be listening.
You've been listening to the Good is Dumb podcast. Check out more of the show on demand at anchor.fm, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, Castbox, Pocket Casts, SoundCloud, YouTube, or wherever podcasts are found. Also connect with and follow LNCB on Facebook, Parler, and Twitter, at Good is Dumb Podcast.